In this video, we're looking at who is offering the best $300-ish GPU, AMD or NVIDIA. NVIDIA coming in with the RTX 4060. I have the Asus dual model running at its out-of-box settings in this video. And AMD coming in with the new RX 7600 XT, which is a 16GB graphics card versus an 8GB graphics card. They're also not at exactly the same pricing, so we do need to talk about that a little bit. The 7600 XT is coming in with a $330 MSRP, and it is widely available at that pricing. The RTX 4060, on the other hand, is a $300 MSRP, and a few models are often available for, $10-ish less than MSRP. Whether or not those are the models you're looking for is up to you, but that is kind of looking at the lowest pricing on the market right now, which means that if we compare MSRPs, the AMD GPU costs 10% more. And if we look at the current lowest pricing of $330 versus $288 on the new market, it's more like a 14 to 15% price increase to go with the AMD GPU. So it does cost a bit more, so we're gonna hope that it's gonna be able to offer enough more to justify that. And there's a bunch of feature set differences beyond just, just the VRAM difference, 16 versus 8. We also have NVIDIA tends to have better ray tracing performance, so we'll test that out here. But if you're at a low enough performance tier, is it the kind of performance you're looking for? And are you wanting to use upscaling at 1080p resolution, for example? Well, we're gonna look at a variety of things in these games. We're gonna focus on the newest games, because if there's gonna be a VRAM difference, that's most likely to impact the latest games rather than testing a bunch of older games. So we're gonna be looking at games like Alan Wake 2, both with ray tracing on and ray tracing off at 1080p and 1440p. We'll look at the highest settings. We'll turn down settings if needed to reach the types of playable frame rates that you would actually want to use. In other words, what we're going to be looking at in this video is more like, what would it actually be like to use these GPUs? Not just run them through a few games at max settings and see which one is what percent faster. So we're trying to look at this a little bit more detailed than that. What sorts of features might you use, including, hey, FSR3 frame generation's available sometimes. DLSS frame generation's available sometimes. When it's available, but FSR frame generation isn't, AMD has fluid motion frames available now. That's a whole thing which I have videos on. GPU reviews are getting pretty complicated these days. We have upscaling differences between FSR and DLSS, but you know what? All of these things factor into somebody actually using a GPU, so we're gonna look at them in this video, and I'm gonna get you some final thoughts at the end. Let's go run the benchmarks. We'll start our testing in Alan Wake 2, which interestingly doesn't have just a native TAA option. You are forced down in either DLSS or FSR pathway, even when rendering at native resolution, like we're seeing here at 1080p. So there are image quality differences, and I do think the DLSS image looks a little bit less fizzly and sparkly. But anyway, the 7600 XT is producing higher frame rates by 16% at 52 versus 45 in the averages. But, we might want higher frame rates than that. One way to get there is to actually use DLSS or FSR upscaling. And now the differences in image quality, I think, are accentuated a bit here, especially if you look at things like that chain link fence we just passed and things like that. I do think it holds up a bit better in the DLSS image. I don't really like upscaling at 1080p, though, if I can help it. And here we're seeing 74 FPS versus 62, which is a 19% lead for the 7600 XT. So the other option would be to turn down graphics settings. Now, I noticed an unexpected and interesting thing happen here, and it was repeatable on multiple restarts of the game and the PC. The 1% lows are just terrible here at low settings for the 7600 XT, meaning the 7600 XT actually wins into the averages by 14%, but the frame time graph is extremely spiky, and it's a very stuttery experience. So that's not good. Anyway, let's go ahead and try out ray tracing. So this game is one of those big path tracing games that NVIDIA has sponsored. And if we kick on the RT high settings, so kick on all the ray tracing, the 4060 wins in a murder-suicide. It's a 75% advantage in the averages, but it's still only 28 versus 16. So really you wouldn't want to play at those settings anyway. And that's using DLSS quality. So we could turn down to less demanding ray tracing settings. This is the RT low preset. And here, again, we're using upscaling. So this is quality level upscaling. So a 720p internal resolution. The DLSS image does look a bit better than FSR here, but performance-wise, we're about tied. But still probably not the performance we'd be looking for. 37 FPS isn't really that exciting. So anyway, let's take a look at 1440p resolution. Here at the high settings, by the way, there is no ultra settings in this game. High is the highest preset. Here we're at native resolution. Again, though, the different pathways, DLSS versus FSR, look a little bit different. And here we're seeing the 7600 XT win by 17% in the averages, but it's only 34 versus 29. The 1% lows are pretty close at 21 versus 19, but really those just aren't the settings you'd probably use to play the game. So one option is upscaling. If we go to quality level upscaling, again, I do think image quality-wise, things are a bit more stable in motion, things like that chain link fence we just passed, objects that are uncovered by the player's character model, things like that do look a little bit more put together on the DLSS image, but performance-wise, it's a massive lead for the 7600 XT by 30% in the averages and 48% in the 1% lows. So another option again, though, would be to turn down the graphic settings. If we go down to the low preset, the game still does look quite good. And here we're actually seeing very similar performance in the averages again, 41 versus 39. But the 1% lows are a huge advantage for the 4060. Again, look at the frame time graph for the 7600 XT. It's very stuttery. And again, the low graphics preset for some reason is extremely stuttery on the 7600 XT in this game. What if we try kicking on quality level upscaling at low settings? Well, now we're seeing the 4060 hit a 58 FPS average. The 7600 XT beats it by 21% with a 70 FPS average, although the 4060 is winning in the 1% lows at 42 versus 36. We still see, there we go, a more spiky looking frame time graph on the 7600 XT. So this game also has DLSS 3 frame generation, but no FSR 3 frame generation, but AMD did recently release its driver level frame generation, which doesn't look as good or work as well, but can be enabled in pretty much any DX11 or DX12 game. The experiences here are so different that I'm just kind of like, hey, here's the results. I'm not going to give you a relative performance difference or anything like that. But you could watch my video on AFMF if you're kind of curious on that. Anyway, the results were so different between these two GPUs, especially with the weird behavior at low settings on the 7600 XT, that I decided I'd actually just do a side-by-side, not of matched settings, but of similar frame rate results at the settings I'd probably use to play the game. So at 1080p resolution, in Alan Wake 2, I think I'd be playing at 1080p low graphics settings with no upscaling. On the 7600 XT, I'd be playing at the high settings with no upscaling, although I do still think the DLSS pathway looks a little bit less fizzly, but they both look pretty good at the native resolution. And the high settings certainly are giving you a little more foliage detail and things like that, although it's pretty subtle. Honestly, the game still does look quite good at low, but you're certainly getting a better experience, I think, overall here on the 7600 XT. And what about at 1440p resolution? Again, because the 7600 XT was having weird behavior at the low settings, but could handle high settings a lot better than the 4060 could, probably due to the high settings pushing a little bit beyond 8 gigabytes of VRAM was probably the issue we were seeing there for the 4060. Here, I would go with the high settings again on the 7600 XT and the low settings on the 4060. And again, both look pretty good, but again, you see, if you're looking for the differences here, look at things like the detail on the ground and things like that. There's definitely more going on the high side. Although the DLSS image, again, as we just saw that chain link fence and things like that, I do think the DLSS image quality is a bit better in motion and more stable. So it does have that going for it. But again, I think overall I would call this a win for the 7600 XT in Alan Wake 2. Now let's go ahead and jump to an AMD sponsored game, which interestingly doesn't even have a non-RT mode. All of the settings in this game do involve some amount of ray tracing, and that might be explaining why the 4060 has a bit of a lead, although honestly, when it's 2 FPS difference, I'd really call it a tie. So here we're seeing 44 versus 42, advantage 5% for the 4060. Probably not the frame rates you'd be looking for in a first-person shooter. So one option is to go down to a quality level upscale. And here I do say if you look at the look at the base, look at like the fence lines and things like that on the base. They look a lot more stable in the DLSS image. So I'm definitely going to give a noticeable advantage to the image quality on DLSS here, although performance-wise, the 4060 is also taking a 64 versus 59 advantage, which is a 9% lead. Now, this game does feature FSR 3 frame generation, but no DLSS 3 frame generation. So you can use frame generation here, but both GPUs have to switch to the FSR upscaling pathway. So, that's a bit of a trade-off here. Performance-wise, they put out about the same results. And, image quality-wise, they're putting out the same results because they're both using FSR now. So that's an option you could use on both. But I think, honestly, at 1080p, I'd personally rather avoid upscaling. Even with DLSS doing a reasonably usable job, I'd probably still rather just turn down to high settings. And now the 4060 hits 59 FPS and the 7600 XT hits 55, so 7% advantage to the 4060. So not a major win here, but it is a win. The 7600 XT does report using more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, but I'm not seeing noticeable issues from the 4060. Perhaps it would take a larger lead if it wasn't, held back by its VRAM capacity, since we are using ray tracing here. Anyway, you could also upscale on the high settings, which then gets you a higher refresh rate experience, which you might prefer in a first-person shooter. Here we're seeing the 4060 pull ahead by 10% at 80 FPS versus 73, and again, the image quality advantage would go to DLSS, again, especially looking at those fence railings and things like that. But once again, if you want to use frame generation, you can, but you're on the FSR pathway for the upscale. So the upscaling now, I think, obviously image quality is the same here. Performance is pretty much the same here, except for the 1% lows. We're actually seeing a better result for the 7600 XT. Again, not sure if that's VRAM related. Could be. But anyway, you could use frame generation there if you want to go down the FSR pipeline. Now, if we go up to 1440p resolution, at ultra settings, neither GPU is doing a good job. The 4060 is winning by 1 FPS in the averages and 2 FPS in the 1% lows. So not a lot in it here, especially since these aren't the settings that I think almost anyone would choose to play the game at. So what are we going to do? Well, one option again is to try out upscaling. We do get a pretty healthy performance boost here, but I'm still not sure it's where we want to be. Again, image quality-wise, at 1440p, I think DLSS has less of a dramatic image quality advantage compared to 1080p, but it's still noticeable. Again, I think things like those fence line rails and things like that are the place, and the further back, the smaller they are, the more it's obvious, is the best place to look. Performance-wise, it's a 5% lead for the 4060. There's not a lot in it. So, the ultra settings, even with upscaling, weren't really doing it. So at 1440p, why don't we try dropping down to the high settings? Well, honestly, still not great performance here on either GPU. 8% lead for the 4060, but it's only 3 FPS, 41 versus 38. The 1% lows are a 1 FPS advantage at 34 versus 33. So again, still not really the experience I think most people are looking for in a first-person shooter. So what if we try kicking on upscaling using the high settings as the base? And now we're seeing the 4060 hit 60 FPS. It's an 11% lead over the 54 FPS on the 7600 XT. The 1% lows are a little tighter at 47 versus 45. Although again, in addition to small performance lead, the 4060 also has a bit of an image quality advantage with the DLSS upscale versus the FSR upscale. However, speaking of FSR, you can use FSR frame generation here. And if we do that, now the 4060 has to take the FSR pipeline for the upscale as well, so it loses the DLSS image quality advantage, and now actually it's also losing the performance advantage. The 7600 XT seems to be performing better off that upscaling result. And again, note that these frame rates are higher now, but it's not equivalent to achieving that frame rate without frame generation. But anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at Cyberpunk at 1080p Ultra, which is not using any ray tracing. The 7600 XT jumps out to a 15% lead at 85 versus 74, and an even more impressive 22% lead in the 1% lows at 66 versus 54. So, pretty good results for the 7600 XT. But what if you kick on ray tracing? Well, this is the other big path tracing showcase, and if we kick on RT overdrive mode with quality level upscaling, the 4060 is at least playable at 38 FPS, and that's more than doubling the performance of the 7600 XT, which is only hitting 18. However, it's 38 FPS in a first-person shooter style game, so while it's technically playable, I don't think it's the way I would choose to play the game. You're also upscaling at 1080p, which isn't amazing. So I thought I'd try out what if we reduced the ray tracing settings, and I tried just sticking to the Ultra preset, but then kicking on ray traced reflections. Because if you're not going down the full path tracing mode, I think the most noticeable ray tracing feature is reflections in this game. And now the 4060 is hitting 55 FPS without any upscaling. The 7600 XT is hitting 44. They're both playable, but it is a very noticeable 25% performance advantage for the 4060. If you are willing to upscale at 1080p, look at the fence line right now and the palm trees in the distance. DLSS has a significant image quality advantage here, to where I would argue quality level upscaling is at least an option you might consider with DLSS, but I'd want to avoid at almost all cost with FSR, personally at least. Still a 26% advantage for the 4060, and it's now hitting 86 FPS. The 7600 XT is performing pretty well now at 68, but again, the FSR image quality didn't look too good there. So now what about frame generation? Well, we can kick on DLSS frame generation as well as AFMF driver level frame generation, which again doesn't work quite as well. But I'm just showing you guys that you can take advantage of a high refresh rate display with frame generation once you hit a high enough base frame rate. Again, it's not equivalent to getting those high frame rates natively. Now, what if we go ahead and go to 1440p resolution, and let's go to ultra settings, and let's do it without any kind of upscaling or frame generation? Well, we're playable at 45 and 52 respectively. It's a 16% lead for the 7600 XT, but still, again, probably not the frame rate target you'd be looking for in a first-person shooter. So if we go ahead and kick on quality level upscaling, at 1080p, the image quality advantages aren't as noticeable for DLSS, but they're certainly still there, especially if you look at the stability in the palm tree branches and things like that right now, you'll probably notice it. But the 7600 XT is taking a 23% performance lead at 69 nice versus 56 on the 4060. So another option here is we could go to high settings rather than ultra. At 1440p high settings, the 7600 XT is able to average 61, and the 4060 is averaging 55. It's an 11% advantage to the 7600 XT, so it's still a lead, but not as dramatic as a lead as we saw at the ultra settings. So somehow the 4060 is able to close the gap a little bit when we turn down to high settings. And if we upscale at the high settings, interestingly, the 4060 seems to gain more from doing so. And it's now actually taking the lead by 2%, and they're tied in the 1% lows. So honestly, performance-wise, it's a tie, but the DLSS image quality advantage does mean I would say that this is an overall win for the 4060 because you're achieving the same frame rates with better image quality. Now, let's go ahead and look at an Unreal Engine 5 game. So now we're looking at RoboCop Rogue City at 1080p epic settings, which is the maximum preset. I would call the performance a tie. Technically, we do have a 2 FPS advantage in the 1% lows for the 7600 XT. Both GPUs are hanging out just a little bit under 60 FPS, so this is certainly a way you could choose to play the game. But there are some other options, one option being go down to the high settings. This doesn't gain a massive amount of performance compared to the epic settings, but it's noticeable, and we're now averaging over 60. It's 64 FPS now on the 4060 and 68 on the 7600 XT, giving the AMD GPU a 6% advantage, so nothing majorly noticeable, but it is a measurable lead. Now, what about 1440p resolution? Well, if we try to run epic settings at 1440p, we're down to 36 FPS. Unreal Engine 5 seems to be, very resolution dependent. So as you bump up the rendering resolution, performance tanks. So 36 FPS. We're tied in the averages. We're also tied in the 1% lows at 32, but this is probably not the way we would play the game. Unreal Engine 5, because it does, its performance is so heavy based on resolution, if you lower that internal rendering resolution by kicking on DLSS and or FSR at the quality setting, performance bumps all the way up to 56 now. For both GPUs, they're tied. 2 FPS lead in the 1% lows for the 7600 XT, but image quality-wise, this game looks really bad with FSR. It's probably the worst FSR implementation of the games I've tested here, so that's something to keep in mind. Now, this game does also offer DLSS 3 frame generation, but not FSR 3 frame generation. However, again, AMD GPUs can kick on their driver level frame generation, which doesn't look quite as good or work quite as well, but it is an option. And again, if you have a high enough base frame rate, you can kick it on. It also seems like it's giving overall more frames than the DLSS was, but they wouldn't be of this as much quality. Anyway, if we turn off all the trickery and go back to native 1440p resolution, we could turn down to high settings and see what happens. Well, we do gain performance, but it's not massive. We're at 42 and 43 FPS average now, 2% lead for the 7600 XT. The 1% lows are a 6% lead, but it's only 2 FPS at 38 versus 36. Still probably not the settings that we'd be looking for. So with that in mind, we could kick on quality level upscaling. Again, I do not like the look of FSR in this game. I'd probably honestly actually use TSR or XESS instead. Look at the street, it's very sparkly on the right-hand side here. The car grille's very sparkly. Anyway, performance is a 5% lead for the 7600 XT at 66 versus 63. But let's jump over to Starfield. At 1080p Ultra settings, neither of these GPUs can deliver 60 FPS in my new Atlantis test run here, although the 7600 XT is taking a noticeable win by 21% at 52 versus 43 on the 4060. The 1% lows are an even more noticeable 30% advantage at 43 versus 33. So those probably weren't the settings that we'd be using anyway, so if we drop all the way down to the medium preset, we can now get better frame rates for a first-person shooter-style combat game, which would give us 79 versus 70 FPS, which is now only a 13% advantage for the 7600 XT, although the 1% lows are still a 23% lead at 65 versus 53. But what if we were going to go up to 1440p resolution? If we try it out at the ultra settings, it's technically playable, but probably not the way you'd want to play it. 40 FPS versus 34 does give the 7600 XT an 18% advantage, and the 1% lows are 34 versus 28, which is a 21% advantage for the 7600 XT. But again, probably not the way you'd be playing, so what if we tried kicking on upscaling? Well, we can go DLSS and FSR at the quality settings, and that does boost frame rates to 50 and 43 respectively, 16% advantage to the 7600 XT. FSR, this is certainly a better implementation than what we saw in RoboCop, for example, but I would still say that DLSS has a bit of an image quality edge here, and the 1% lows are a 24% lead for the 7600 XT. Now, this game has been updated to include both FSR 3 and DLSS 3 frame generation. So now we can actually put the two actual frame generations, techs head to head here. Interestingly, the 7600 XT seems to generate way more frames using FSR 3 than DLSS 3 gives to the 4060, but they're not necessarily of equal quality, and especially upscaling wasn't of equal quality either. Anyway, let's go over to the medium settings at 1440p, where now the 7600 XT can hit 58 FPS without any upscaling, and the 4060 is at 52. That's a 12% advantage for the 7600 XT, but once again, the 1% lows are showing an even larger 28% advantage for the 7600 XT at 51 versus 40. Now, you could upscale at the medium settings if you want to get a higher refresh rate experience. And so if we do that, we're now getting 76 versus 71, so the 7600's lead has dropped to a 7% lead. The 1% lows are a more noticeable 17% advantage at 63 versus 54, but while it's a performance win for the 7600 XT, I will say the image quality win I still think does go to DLSS. But again, we could kick on frame generation. So once you're at, that 70 FPS kind of baseline, frame generation usually works pretty well from both image quality and responsiveness standpoint. Now, the DLSS upscale is looking better than the FSR3 upscale is here, but we're generating more frames on the FSR3 pathway, so the overall frame rate is higher. It's really hard to, it's so far from an apples-to-apples comparison. I don't know, guys. It's getting hard to do GPU reviews. Let's jump over to Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart at the very high settings at 1080p. Both GPUs are doing pretty well at 93 versus 83, 12% lead for the 7600 XT, but the frame time graph is a bit spikier on the 4060, giving a 28% advantage in the 1% lows to the 7600 XT. And I believe it's VRAM related. Look how much VRAM the 7600 XT is allocating over here. It's quite a bit. Now, if we kick on ray tracing, I kicked it up to high rather than very high to be respectful for these GPUs performance class. And the 4060 is able to hit 57 FPS. The 7600 XT hits 52, 10% lead for the 4060, and a 6% win in the 1% lows. So this is certainly usable, but if you kick on DLSS and FSR, performance jumps quite a bit to 74 versus 72. But if you look at the 1% lows, they're down at 33, and the frame time graph on the 4060 looks very spiky frequently, and the 7600 XT has more intermittent spikes. So it's not super smooth on either of those options, unfortunately. So I don't think the VRAM capacity is up for the task on the 4060. And speaking of that issue, if we go up to 1440p resolution and go to the very high settings, no ray tracing, well, they're basically tied in the averages. Look at the 1% lows, 46 versus 24. That's a 92% lead for the 7600 XT in the 1% lows. Look at the frame time graph on the 4060. It's spiking all over the place. And if you look at the VRAM allocation on the 7600 XT, it's certainly indicating that it could have been VRAM related. Kicking on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting helps bring them closer together in the 1% lows, but we're still seeing a lot more spikes on the 4060. We're still seeing a 50% advantage in the 1% lows at 66 versus 44 on the 7600 XT. So it's really looking like the very high settings at 1440p are too much VRAM for the 4060 to have a smooth experience. Now, you can also kick on DLSS 3 frame generation in this game. Doesn't have an FSR3 option, but again, we could frame generate through the driver level. It's, again, of lesser quality and all of that than what you get from the in-game version, because it has more access to the motion vectors and things like that. So anyway, also the frame time graph is still spiky on the 4060, so frame generation doesn't really solve that problem. Turning down to the high settings rather than the very high settings does seem to improve the frame time graph. It settles down quite a bit. It's not perfectly flat, but it's much better. And the GPUs are performing a lot more similarly now at 68 versus 66 in the averages and 51 versus 46 in the 1% lows. So a 3% lead in the averages and an 11% lead in the 1% lows for the 7600 XT. Now, we can kick on upscaling off of the high settings as a baseline at 1440p and now get a pretty nice high refresh rate experience. Averaging 89 versus 96, advantage 7600 XT by 8%. The 1% lows are 61 versus 74, so a 21% advantage for the 7600 XT there. So again, it could be VRAM related still. I don't know. Let's go ahead and move on to Baldur's Gate 3, where interestingly, we see the 7600 XT lead by 12% in the averages, but the 4060 leads by 11% in the 1% lows. So, I don't know, do we call it a tie? The frame time graph has these intermittent spikes on both GPUs, but they're more pronounced on the AMD GPU. So, I don't know, kind of an interesting result there. If we move up to 1440p, we're kind of seeing the same behavior, just at lower frame rates. 61 FPS versus 67, giving the 7600 XT a 10% lead in the averages. But 49 versus 44, giving the 4060 an 11% lead in the 1% lows. And again, we're seeing those intermittent frame time spikes at regular intervals on the frame time graph for the 7600 XT, which is kind of interesting. Let's go ahead and move on to Resident Evil 4 at the maximum preset, which does include some light ray tracing and does use a lot of VRAM. We're actually seeing the 4060 take the lead by 14%, 75 versus 66. Again, this is a ray tracing test. And the 1% lows, though, do give the advantage to the 7600 XT by 7%. Could be VRAM related. Now, if we go to the prioritize graphics preset, we now don't have any ray tracing, and now the GPUs are basically tied, and overall frame rates are a lot higher. Honestly, I don't like the ray tracing in this game. I think it looks grainy and not very good, so I turned it off even when I was playing on a 4090. I also turned off the screen space reflections because they looked grainy and bad as well. But anyway, overall performance is good now. We're over 100 FPS on both GPUs, and it's basically a tied, and the frame time graphs look great. At 1440p max settings, we're definitely hitting VRAM issues on the 4060. You can see some massive stutters and frame time spikes, leading to a 74% advantage in the 1% lows for the 7600 XT and the 33% advantage in the averages. So definitely not enough VRAM for the 4060 to do 1440p max ray tracing in this game. Now, if you switch down to the prioritize graphics preset, both GPUs perform much better, and the results are basically a tie again. 3% lead for the 7600 XT and 2% lead in the 1% lows. They're both averaging in the mid-70s now at 74 versus 76, and the frame time graphs look nice and flat. And yeah, I think I'd be much more likely to use these settings on both GPUs, to be honest. And let's go ahead and check out one more game. How about Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 at 1080p basic settings? We're seeing a 19% advantage for the 7600 XT at 210 versus 177 frames per second. The 1% lows are 135 versus 107, which is a 26% advantage for the 7600 XT. So it's definitely looking like a win for the 7600 XT. Now, what about 1440p resolution? Well, that's 144 FPS versus 124, giving a 16% advantage for the 7600 XT. And in the 1% lows, the 7600 XT is 31% faster at 93 versus 71. So it's looking like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 is a winner for AMD. Let's pop out for some final thoughts. This is kind of a complicated review, guys. I think one thing we might want to look at is stuff like this. How would you actually choose to play the game on each GPU? Which one will end up offering you the better experience? Well, if we look at a game like Alan Wake 2, where I think VRAM was potentially a problem for the NVIDIA GPU, we were seeing that we could stick to higher graphics settings than we on the 7600 XT than we could on the 4060 and achieve similar performance results. So it's not apples to apples testing, other than maybe actually it is if you're kind of just locking in, if I'm trying to achieve a certain frame rate, what would my experience be like getting there? And AMD does offer a bit higher graphic settings in this game. However, once we move up to 1440p resolution, we kind of have the added difference of a lot of times you're gonna end up wanting to upscale. So here we end up with kind of what makes this kind of thing so hard in a comparison video is that, okay, the AMD GPU is running at higher graphics settings and it has the VRAM to do that. The 4060 is running at lower overall graphics settings, both of them achieving around 60 FPS here, but they're both upscaling from the same internal resolution. But NVIDIA's using DLSS versus AMD using FSR does mean that in motion, certain details are going to look better on the DLSS image. Things like this chain link fence and things like that, especially, are noticeable. And depending on the game, you know, different things stand out. So it's not a flat out everything about the AMD experience here is better in this game. Some things are better, some things are worse. And which of those things you're more drawn to kind of, you know, matters. Does that kind of make sense? So why don't we look at this kind of game by game? So in Avatar, which is ray tracing only, despite being an AMD sponsored title, I think the GPUs perform fairly similarly. Although, you know, in the end, you do often get a bit of an edge for the ray tracing performance on the 4060. even when we're cranking the settings a bit, but especially if we go down to settings you might actually use. So like in 1080p resolution, I think on Avatar, I think 1080p high settings probably how I'd play the game on these GPUs, because I'd try to avoid upscaling at 1080p. Even with DLSS, although if I was going to upscale, I think DLSS provides a noticeably better experience at 1080p. So here, I think I'm going to give the 4060 a bit of the win at 1080p in Avatar, although it's fairly close. And then at 1440p resolution, I think you pretty much have to go down to high settings and upscale if you're wanting to get around a 60 FPS experience. And again, here, I think the 4060 is offering a bit of a better experience. So I think in Avatar, the 4060 does seem to be the slightly preferred choice here. You're getting a bit better performance and a better upscale, which the upscale matters if you're playing at 1440p there. How about in Cyberpunk? In Cyberpunk, if playing at 1080p resolution, I think I would just choose to go with the ultra settings with no ray tracing and no upscaling, in which case the 7600 XT definitely seems to be offering the better experience, especially when you're checking the 1% lows. Now, again, it's maybe 15% faster, and you're also paying 10 to 15% more money, so is it really offering much more value? Not necessarily, but I think it is offering the better experience. And so when the 4060 offers significantly better ray tracing performance in the path tracing mode, I think it's kind of irrelevant, because I wouldn't want to be playing the game at 38 frames per second. So I wouldn't use those settings, so I don't think it's relevant here. It's a bit interesting when you look at the RT reflections, because in this case, the 4060 is offering a reasonable experience someone might actually choose to use, even without upscaling. Although that choice of 55 FPS versus playing the game at just ultra settings without the reflections at 74, I think I'd probably, in a first-person shooter style game, stick to the 74. And of course, you can use upscaling with the RT reflections. But again, 1080p upscaling, if I'm gonna do it, I do think DLSS provides noticeably better image quality on a lot of things, especially like these palm tree branches and things like that in motion. But overall, I'd probably personally avoid the upscale. I'm not sure the RT reflections are adding enough to the experience for me to deal with the upscaling at 1080p image quality here. So I think at 1080p, I'd probably stick to just the default ultra settings on both of these GPUs, and I think AMD is offering the better experience there. At 1440p resolution, neither GPU is doing great at the ultra settings. If you kick on upscaling at Ultra, things are doing a bit better, and AMD certainly has a large performance lead. But I think the high settings, and especially high settings with upscaling, is probably how I would play. And the interesting thing here is that while AMD did have a significant lead when we were at the Ultra settings, if we're at the high settings, the lead closes, and when we upscale, they're actually tied in performance, but NVIDIA has the better image quality through DLSS. So I'd actually say I think at the settings I would actually play this game at, I'd probably give a bit of an edge to the 4060 here at 1440p, which is really surprising me, because I thought having the extra VRAM would most likely lead me to more often choose the 7600 XT when we were at 1440p resolution. But there's games where it's like, well, if you're turning down the graphic settings and upscaling to reach the frame rates you would want, because these GPUs just aren't very powerful. And when you turn down graphic settings and upscale, then the VRAM buffer isn't as big of an issue. Anyway, in our Unreal Engine 5 game we tested out with RoboCop Rogue City, I think I would prefer to just play at 1080p, either epic settings or high settings. And in either case, it was very similar performance. I think I'd probably end up playing at the high settings, and AMD has a little bit of an edge here, although it's less of a performance lead than you're paying in price, right? Remember, it's at least a 10% price increase, possibly 14 to 15% price increase. So it's not blowing me away from a value perspective, maybe offering a slightly better experience. At 1440p resolution, the epic settings without upscaling were a bust. Epic settings with DLSS or FSR quality is usable. And this is a game where I thought, FSR upscaling looked especially unimpressive. The street's very shimmery, the car grill's very unstable, things like that. You could switch to a different upscaling method like TSR, and I think get a better look with slightly worse performance. Just throwing that out there. But I think probably going down to the high settings with upscaling is really the only way that we're breaking 60 FPS here at 1440p, in which case, well, high settings with upscaling. We're getting similar performance, slight but not very noticeable performance lead from the 7600 XT. But like I said, the image quality on the upscale from the 4060 is noticeably better with DLSS in this game. So again, this is one where I actually think I'm slightly preferring the experience on the 4060. Interesting, at 1440p. Interesting. Now at 1080p Ultra in Starfield, AMD has a massive advantage, but is still only hitting 52 FPS here in New Atlantis. If we drop down to medium settings, we're now hitting more like the frame rates I'd like to hit, and AMD's lead is smaller, but is still noticeable, especially in the 1% lows. So at 1080p in Starfield, I think I'm preferring the 7600 XT. At 1440p, I don't think the Ultra settings make a lot of sense. You could kick on upscaling. You're still not getting that good of a base frame rate. So while yes, you could generate frames from that point, I think it's from below the point at which I prefer the base frame rate to be for upscaling. So I think I'd probably drop down settings to something like medium, in which case we on the 7600 XT, you could play around 60 FPS at 1440p medium, and the 4060 is having a little more trouble getting there. And if we look at the 1% lows, there's a pretty big difference. Now, once you kick on upscaling, the performance gap closes a bit, still a more noticeable lead in the 1% lows for AMD here. But again, the upscaling image quality advantage makes this one maybe a wash here, because kind of you gain something with a bit more frame rate, especially in the 1% lows, but you lose something in image quality on the AMD GPU. So this is again a case where when we turn down the graphics settings and upscale to reach the frame rates that we want at 1440p, the advantages for the 7600 XT kind of seem to diminish. Anyway, we also had Ratchet and Clank, where at 1080p very high settings, I think especially you're noticing this in the 1% lows, I think this is a game where 8 gigabytes of VRAM does not do a great job even at 1080p resolution. So I think you're getting a noticeably better experience from the AMD GPU at 1080p here. Trying to kick on the ray tracing settings, the 1% lows are in pretty bad shape, so even though the average frame rates are maybe playable, the frame time graphs were pretty stuttery, so again, I don't think ray tracing really made much of a difference here. And if we go into using DLSS and FSR, the 1% lows are still not great. The game's still kind of stuttery, so I don't think I'd be using ray tracing on these GPUs in this game. At 1440p, again, the very high settings, perfectly playable on the 7600 XT, a bit of a disaster in the 1% lows for the 4060. So I think this is one where the 1440p results are definitely favoring the 7600 XT. You could try kicking on DLSS and FSR, but the 1% low issue is not totally solved. You're still getting a spikier frame time graph from the 4060. So this is one where I think I'm definitely getting a better experience from AMD. However, you can turn down to the high settings, and that mostly comes under control. So there is that. But I think I'm definitely preferring AMD in this game. I think it's a game that draws a lot of VRAM. Baldur's Gate 3, we saw a bit of an advantage in the averages for AMD, advantage in the 1% lows for NVIDIA, but honestly, they're both giving you a pretty good experience for this style of game and those frame rates. And if you cap the FPS, you can kind of smooth out those 1% low issues. Anyway, in Resident Evil 4, this is a game where with its max ray tracing settings, the VRAM can become an issue, but honestly, I'd probably just not use the ray tracing settings in this game. They're not visually impactful for the performance hit that you're getting, in which case these GPUs offer basically the same experience at both 1080p, and while at 1440p max, again, AMD takes a big advantage due to VRAM. Neither one's giving you the experience you'd probably be looking for, so again, I'd just play without it, in which case they're again giving us basically a tied experience. And then in Call of Duty, we're actually getting a pretty noticeable win here for AMD at both 1080p and 1440p. So this is my long-winded way of saying, You know what? I really think AMD needs to lower the price on the 7600 XT. I do think that overall, I would rather have it, but yeah, it's like it's not always a clear win. And so I'm not sure, guys. This is a tough call. I do like having the 16 gigabytes of VRAM, and I also understand that that does add to the manufacturing cost because your bill of materials list goes up. So it does cut into the margins if they price it equivalently to the 4060. I get that. But in the end, there's a lot of situations where I just don't think that it's really paying off in a meaningful way. So, are we usually offering 10 to 15% more performance at the equivalent settings that we'd probably actually be playing the games at? And I would say oftentimes no. So I think this is one where I think I would rather have the 7600 XT, especially for longevity. And while the settings I was looking at this game were like matched settings, in the sense that, I'm kind of using presets. It's certainly true that with the additional VRAM buffer, you can kind of tweak settings in a little bit of a different way, maybe leave textures up more often and things like that. So I think it does give you something a bit more to work with. And I think if AMD would get its upscaling, its FSR upscaling up to the image quality levels of DLSS, then I think this would just be an easy win for the 7600 XT. But because we have to consider that, especially if you're playing at 1440p, where I think will often need to be upscaling with GPUs of this performance level, well, then that just means that a lot of times you're getting a worse image quality, even if the performance is a little bit similar or better, and that's kind of disappointing, right? So anyway, that's where I'm at with this. I think I would rather have the 7600 XT, but I think it's not a complete blowout. And so for it charging more, that kind of sucks. I think if they priced it right at $300, I could say they cost the same, and I think I'd rather have the 7600 XT. Now it's like, well, it costs more, and I think it is a little bit better, but it has some drawbacks. So anyway, I don't think the ray tracing is a meaningful thing at this performance tier, though. So at least I don't think make your buying decision based on that. Upscaling's where it became a little bit more interesting. I hope you guys found this video useful and or interesting, and a huge thank you to channel members who have clicked the join button to directly support the channel financially, in which case I can do things like buy the 7600 XT for testing. So huge thank you. I totally understand not everybody can afford to do that, and that is totally fine. And a huge thank you to viewers, subscribers, everybody, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.